Our next speaker is also an Icelandic, all the way from the cold Northern Isle, but now also at the University of Oslo. So both the University of Iceland and University of Oslo are doing Viking and medieval
Norse studies.
Norse, yes.
Same
Viking medieval
studies.
Norse studies, same study as Max. So perfect. Grab your pillows, hide under the blankets, because this is going to be really scary. Actually, I've had the pleasure of hearing this talk before, and I didn't sleep for a week. So I hope everyone is ready. It was yesterday. I'm exaggerating. But today, Eliot will be talking about DRAUGR in Old Norse literature. So please, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Okay, so today is about Synchronicity, the development of the Corporeal Revenant in the medieval North. Now, I know this is a pre-Christian conference, but I'm going to be talking a lot about Christianity because I'm going to be looking at the development of the Revenant, DRAUGR, zombie, whatever you want to call them, through the Christian period. And because of this, I've taken the word sacrifice a little bit more generally to mean anything given up. So I'm going to talk about the sacrifice that is involved in Christianization. So there's this idea that when you have a conversion period, you'll have to give up some of your dominant theology in order to accommodate pagan beliefs or pre-Christian beliefs. So then you can then convert those pagans. The most famous example in Iceland of this is upon the conversion of Iceland. They were still allowed to eat horse meat and expose babies, at least according to Ari the Wise. This didn't stick around for very long. This law got taken out very quickly. But when this stuff does stick around, it creates what is sort of like a heretical folklore, a folklore that really goes against dominant Christian theologies. I put heretical in scare quotes because it's almost certain that the people who believed and transmitted this folklore didn't believe they were doing anything heretical. But it doesn't work with Christianity still. And so people often trace these things back to pre-Christian belief because the idea that they happened in Christianity is a bit far-fetched. So revenants are a really, really good example of this because they really just shouldn't exist in Christian ideology. They shouldn't, and I'll get into why in a bit. But it suggests that they were probably inherited from some pre-Christian belief system. However, it's important to note synchronicity. Just because something goes against Christianity doesn't mean it doesn't still work with it in certain ways. So the question I'm going to be asking today is, does the DRAUGR work in confluence with Christian ideas at all? Spoiler, yes. So this is an example of a DRAUGR being converted into Christian ideals contemporarily. So we have Dietmar de Messenburg, who is writing his Chronicon Tetmari. He's writing during the conversion of the Slavic tribes east of the Elbe. This is during the Wendish rebellion still, so it's a little bit of a tumultuous time for poor Dietmar here. And he writes, in his history, he writes these ghost stories, one of which is about a bishop who gets raised up to hold mass for all of the dead bodies in the churchyard. And this, Dietmar says, is proof that the resurrection can happen. This is a very heretical statement on his part, but we'll let it slide. And Nancy Kekiola has argued that this is actually being used as a pedagogical tool. So Dietmar has taken some folklore from the Slavic tribes, something probably related to our Eastern European vampires, has taken that and sort of put a Christian layer on top in order to explain the resurrection to newly converted Slavic people. But then Kekiola goes on to say the DRAUGR that we find in the Icelandic are the same thing, and it's a little bit of a different situation. But first, before we get into that, it's a DRAUGR. So the word comes from a Proto-Indo-European root meaning to deceive. It's a verbal root that you then tack on a thematic ending, which is turns into our as, and it becomes a noun of something that deceives, or someone who deceives. This is why in the Old High German we have our cognate gitrog, deception, or our Old Saxon gidrog, mirage. And you can kind of see how this ethereal illusion can go into ghost quite neatly. We have a parallel example of this happening in Old Irish with erdrech, which means phantom, comes from the same root of deception. So it's this idea that you have an illusion, then somehow becomes something spooky. This makes sense that the DRAUGR is a very ethereal semantic space. Like this is a not very physical concept, and it makes sense in a pre-Christian context because with having cremation and inhumation, it not really seeming like there's much of a pattern. There certainly fluctuates. It suggests that the concept of the corpse, the actual object of the corpse, wasn't particularly relevant in the concept of afterlife or anything like that, because you burn it, you destroy it, or you don't. It doesn't matter. We don't have very many poetic instances of a DRAUGR, but here is one. So Kalikosen is, this is all preserved in Orkney saga. The Kalikosen is writing at the beginning of the 12th century. And the context here is Kali has just walked into a cave to find treasure, found no treasure, and can't also light his torch. So he builds a little can to mark that he was there, and he leaves. And he says in his verse, here I have raised a high pan to a strong-minded ghost in the dark hill stone hollow. In this way I look for rings. There is no mention of a ghost or a DRAUGR or anything in the prose text or in any of the other following stanzas. So it suggests that the idea that the only thing that matters to make a DRAUGR is to build a cairn. Does the actual body inside completely irrelevant? You might put it there, you might not, who cares? It's the pile of stones that is like the location of this spirit, is not attached to any physical remains. So in Christianity are semi, they're often a sign of sainthood, like the Apostle of the North sees his dead mother and Saint Mary. This is a sign of his holiness. We also have the Stuart manuscript, is a translation of the Old Testament from Iceland in the 14th century. And the spirit of King Samuel, who's been raised from the dead, is actually called a DRAUGR. This is possibly because it's heretical, because the witch of Endor has raised him. So it's like this concept of some pagan raising. It's probably what they perceived when they wrote this. So mainly ghost invasions are heretical because it's just usually God that does it, right? But it doesn't really work in the way Christians at this time dead and how they function. So how do they function? Christians are concerned with an extremely material eschatology, which is a fancy way of saying at the end of times, when Jesus is in Jesus' second coming, he will raise you from the dead, he will resurrect you. But it is your physical corpse, the thing that you leave behind, your physical matter, is the thing that gets raised up. No idea of a soul at this point, it's your physical matter. So this begins in the 5th century with people like Augustine and St. Jerome, who are very scared about decay and also what happens to all of your fingernails that you cut throughout your life. And in the 12th century, we have this idea of the self, who you are as a person, is very located in your physical matter. There's no concept of something separate. We also get concerned about fragmentation and reassemblage. This whole thing is basically about my hand gets cut off, do I get resurrected without a hand? What happens to that hand when I get resurrected? Also, what should I do with that hand right now? Should I bury it on consecrated ground? The answer is yes, you should, because God will knit you back together. And only by the 14th century, the theologians really start to begin to concern themselves with the soul. Now, this is not just like a scholastic theological debate from the continent. This is why inhumation is so important in Christian burials. We don't want to take away the parts of you that will become you forever, and why cremation is so confronting to them, because you're destroying this vessel of yourself. We also have evidence of it in the Christian markers of DRAUGR. So they understand reassemblage. There's a lot of talk about what to do if you just find a random body part in the fjords, what you can do with that. They have evidence of body continuity. So the idea that my matter is me, it will always will be me. So if I eat an animal that has eaten a person, I have eaten that person. So you can't eat carrion birds, you can't eat their eggs, you can't eat any animal that you think might have been eaten a person once. Also, if your pig eats a horse, you have to starve your pig for 3 months so that the matter until it's physically initiated, so the matter of the horse leaves the pig, and then you keep the pig. So we can understood this concept, right? And so the problem of the Revenant is that really only the power of God at the end of the world should be able to raise you up. Nothing. The idea of that is crazy before that, and also. A sinful creature is corruptible. Only saints cannot decay because they're also holy and perfect. So this idea that the physical revenant who has not decayed and is some sort of evil force is just quite heretical, not good. So this would maybe suggest that the corporeal revenant could be a pre-Christian context. But let's have a look at its thinking. So in the 14th century, there are a couple. So we have the Stuart manuscript, which I mentioned before. We have the new Christian section of Bulletin, which I can read it here. How exciting! So in both manuscripts, it talks about you should the punishment for heathenry is to give up all of your wealth. And these examples are if you believe in land spirits, in groves, in cans, or if you set out to get your future told. And also that you should give up all your wealth if you're one who tempts Draugar up and tries to wake them, or the same with Pugbury. So we get this idea that these spirits and scary things that are very heathen and we don't like them because this is the Christianity era are still very spiritual at this point. Same with Laxala saga. We get one mention of the word Draugar, not in the famous one, with Hrab, in Thorkel's drowning. So Thorkel is Gudrun's fourth husband, and he drowns at sea and shows up as a ghost. And we know this is a ghost because his body is at sea, shows up as a ghost, as a Draugar. So these are all very ethereal. And then we get Flomana saga, which is, I'm going to say, the 14th century. We have some troubles with the manuscripts here. But the Draugar here is called Draugar and begins very ethereally. He's just a sound. Thorgils is hearing him all night. And then he becomes corporeal the moment that he is met at his camp. And at this moment, he becomes very corporeal because he is both hard and grim, so that earth comes up from around his feet. He's so heavy that the earth is coming up behind him. So he suddenly becomes extremely physical. And after this point, he's no longer called a Draugar, he's called an afterganga, after walker. And this dualism of the ethereal Draugar and the suddenly very physical afterganga has made people, some scholars, find the term Draugar a little bit unfashionable. So people like Armin Jakobsen and Rebecca Merkelbach have started only using the word afterganga instead of Draugar to emphasize the physicality that they see as so important in these figures in the Icelandic saga. Not particularly questioning why, but they find it very important. So, Hrap and Laxala saga, Glamour and Gratis saga, Thorolfur and Erebigja saga, all of them are afterganga. They are never Draugar. Thorgina from Erebigja saga is very nice, and she makes the meal for everyone while her body is being transported to Skalholt. She is an afterganga, and we get hordes of afterganga who break bones and kill people in Feyringa saga and Erik saga Rauda. So we only get this sort of physical Draugar again when you get to the 15th and 16th century with Hrafsagi Kraka. You get some ghosts who fight people. But at this time, in the mid 14th century, there's suddenly all of these very, very physical revenants. So Afterganga, we've established that they are maybe really heretical, right? But I think that they're actually a little bit, there's something else going on here, because they function very synchronously with the ideas of the physical corpse that I was talking about before. They agree with the Christian location of the self. The self Hrap is Hrap before, Hrap when he dies, Hrap after he dies. And this idea that like you are your corpse is you, that they're very synonymous. And then it also aligns with the potential animacy of the Christian corpse. Nancy Cacchiola tries to argue that this is a pagan idea. Maybe that works with the Slavic people, but here it really is seems to be a Christian one of the understanding that your dead matter is, there's possibly something that could happen there later. And they also display bodily continuity and retention of self. So all of the mean old men in Laxdala Saga, Grettir Saga, and Erdigia Saga, they continue to be mean and violent, and they after their death. And when you have a nice one, such as Thorgina, who's very nice before her death, she's very nice after her death, and like, makes people a really lovely meal. And most importantly, I think, and this is something often I think scholars of monsters tend to overlook, is how the mechanism of horror of any monster should be and always is culturally relevant. It's only scary if I find it scary. And so this idea that whatever the way that it's scary should be relevant to the culture it's scary for. So Rebecca Merkelbach just kind of brushes this away and says, Walking Dead are uncanny. She uses the Freudian Unheimlich. But it's much, much more than that for a Christian audience, right? It is an inversion and corruption of what you perceive as yourself now and forever, your eternity, but also who your concept of yourself at this very moment. You see this horrible, disgusting, heretical, scary version of it. And it's precisely the heresy of a physical DRAUGR, or physical afterganga, sorry, that produces this terror. Also, very importantly, the afterganga are never ever laid to rest. They are always dismembered. Usually their heads are cut off or they're burnt, which is also a very confronting thing for a Christian audience. You get from ghosts to zombies. So DRAUGR begins in a very ethereal semantic space, and there is certainly evidence that it was a ghost, and frankly remains a ghost up until the 15th century, when you just get a blur of lines with like what this folklore actually is representative of. And then we get the afterganga, which seems to be a bit of a later occurrence. And it likely gained dominance, which it certainly did. There are far more attestations of an afterganga than a DRAUGR. It likely gained dominance because it had this synchronicity with the Christian belief system. It's difficult to say that if the afterganga was there pre-Christian, you can't say, who knows? But the reason that we end up seeing more afterganga is because it works far better with a Christian context. So to bring back to the concept of sacrifice, just as the Christians would have had to sacrifice some of their belief to allow revenants to exist at all within this folklore, the DRAUGR and other revenants must have had to sacrifice their incorporeality and gain this corporealness in order to accommodate Christian theology as well. And there's my manuscripts, and there's my bibliography.
Again, it was really enjoyed that again. Are there any questions about DRAUGR?
I was going to ask if you had seen Ármann Jakobsson's stuff about the DRAUGR as vampires.
I
see that you have.
Yes. He argument of DRAUGR as vampires with the first translation of Dracula into Icelandic, translated vampire as DRAUGR. It's where he gets his like concept from, and he sort of runs with that. The vampirism, I think, is just I think it's a misunderstanding of where DRAUGR come from. And in this, he talks about afterganga, much closer to the Eastern European Slavic myth of the vampire, or the folklore of the vampire. And I think that it's a bit of a reach, in my opinion.
I also was going to ask if you had an opinion on how Skallagrímur from Egil Saga fits in with all this, because there's the episode where Egil breaks the wall and like blocks up the door. He breaks the wall and puts the corpse through the wall,
yeah,
so that if he came back, he wouldn't be able to get in the house.
Because there's no doorway. Yeah.
Eliot,
So
would you mind
yeah, I was
just-
just about to do that.
Thanks.
So the question was, how does this all fit in with Skaplegrimr from Eos Saga, who, yeah, they knock down the wall when he dies to go bury him outside and build it back up again so that he can't come back in. I almost included that he doesn't actually raise from the dead, but the worry that he will is connected to this idea that he's a very violent man, and this violence will then continue into his life. The concept that they have to come through doorways. This actually does, I didn't have a chance to put this into the presentation, but a lot of the places where these people are buried is centered around doorways. I believe Knepper wants to be buried in the doorway. You also see in Laxdala Saga, the other person I mentioned, Draugar, appears first in the doorway. So there is a aspect to this that is very the liminal space of doors and where they can come in. But again, this only really occurs in the Icelandic saga, in the later material. And I'd argue it's probably this idea that, oh, if they're physical beings, there's increased physicality. We have to think about them actually entering our spaces, as opposed to some ethereal being who they tend to stay close or around or in their mounds. So it's not as much of a threat that way. Yeah, it is really cool. That was a cool episode.
Yeah, I was thinking about the Christianization when you have the Draugar as this entity connected to the Högr or to the Cairn. When you go to Christianity and you lose or you want to stop people from having a religious relationship to the cairns and all this, isn't it then sort of, it makes sense to have literally the Draugar walk out of his cairn to make it less important in a sense?
Yeah.
So it sort of works.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
So the question is about Christianization. If we take the assumption that the cairn is the location of the Draugar, then on Christianization, to decenter the religious potency of the cairn, you have him walk out and go away from it. I think that could possibly be part of it, but I also struggle to see evidence that on a wide sort of folkloric scale of discouraging certain, like, actively poisoning sort of ideas to decenter things. It's probably a happy accident in my opinion, but I think that it's more that if you were a Christian, not a theologian, just a Christian who believed how your dead body works, and you saw a dead body in a cairn and you saw that and you were like, oh, what has the potency? You'd probably pick the dead body over they probably just thought they were just rocks, and they knew that the heathens build up these rocks and it's weird. I don't like it. But I would argue it's probably more in terms of the everyday person, more of just a relocating to where you understand the power of the personhood to be, I guess, but I'm open to discussion. Yeah.
The two sons of their father, all bloodied from their duel. And the article I was reading about it was linking that to sort of the rituals of, like, telling the fathers to seek revenge or conversation or whatever. But you've also got in Laxdala Saga the I don't know, the sorceress or whatever the one that's like under the place where Gudrun says her prayers, like coming in a dream to complain about her. I mean, do you think that they're kind of putting the dead in dreams rather than as Draugar or something corporeal? Is that another element of Christianization? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
No, that's a really, really interesting concept. So the question is how do visions of the dead in dreams associate with this? So the word draumr for dream, a dream, comes from the same root as Draugar. It is, I won't go into the Indo-Europeanness of it, but they're associated terms. Still this idea of something, a deception and etherealness. So I would probably argue that it certainly dreams seem to be enough of a presence in the corpus to suggest that maybe it was, and this is the same sort of Draugar dream, this power of the ethereal deception, and how that continues. And I think it just works really well with some Christian ideas of how dreams work. So I think that it's not an overtaking, but I think that one's a true parallel probably, as opposed to this, which is a little bit more of a development. Yeah, that's a really interesting concept there.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the shared etymology there. I didn't know that, so yeah.
Yeah, it's very cool. Awesome.
Do we have any other? Oh, yeah, plenty.
Would you rather be a zombie or a ghost?
I'd rather be a Sami or a ghost?
A zombie.
A
Probably.
zombie. That the concept of the dead is so very interested. I'd so much rather be a zombie. Like the way that like inflicts on the psyche, I think is way cooler than like I'm just a ghost over here in my pile of rocks. Yeah.
That's a great question. Cleo, I saw your hand reaching to the sky.
Kinds of spirit that are seen as part of the environment.
Mhm.
And I really enjoyed the part where you said that it's the perception of the uncanny that makes it scary or not scary.
Yeah.
Familiar.
Yeah.
Would you say that DRAUGR are familiar or
Well, it's a little bit. Oh yes, sorry. Thank you. So the question is about are the Draugar sort of like different from the horse spirits, and are they sort of like a familiar or a different uncanny? Like how do they function with sort of the philosophy of horror that we have here? I would firstly, it's very difficult to say from a pre-Christian perspective of what they found scary and why they found it scary. I would imagine that I mean, like it depends on. I'm personally not an archaeologist, so if I am wrong, I'm very, very sorry. But this concept of having grave mounds, being a visual, being a monument that you're supposed to visit, having runestones that talk for themselves because they have like gained the agency somehow. I would imagine that Draugar are a little bit less scary than the physical one. Because of this sort of familiar nature of you're meant to go to the cairn, you're meant to see them, you're meant to interact with this burial site in some way. But that being said, it could also be like spooky ghost is here, shouldn't. But like this idea that the landscape, the rocks themselves, the cairn. No, that's a good question. No, there are. The word Draugar is interestingly very ubiquitous in scholarship, but is very little attested. It is much attested later when we have sort of like Icelandic folklore and all of the stuff, and often translations will just say afterganga, they'll say Draugar to like link up these two ideas to the point where often scholars don't know the difference and they will refer to people as Draugar who are afterganga, they're never referred to as Draugar. So the actual ethereal thing, we're never actually told what it looks like or what it acts like. Poetry is a little bit tricky because they tend not to describe things at all. So there are a couple of other attestations in poetry, but they're also just like, and they're the ghost.
Yes, that was perfect. Thank you so much.